What is Prairietown?
Prairietown is a lot of things.
To me, Prairietown is probably the essence of what Conner Prairie's core experience became.
Prairietown is more than just buildings. It is a community.
A composite community that's set in 1836, and we have characters that celebrate and have weddings and funerals and have conflicts and drama.
Prairietown to me is an opportunity for learning, for teaching, for experimenting.
It's a tool to teach people, how people lived back in the 1830s. It's a place where people can actually enter into history, and become a part of history.
You don't have to stand back. There's no barriers. You can step forward and participate if you want to.
Think about not only where we came from, but what that means for where we're at today.
And you can enjoy it on its surface because it's a visual feast, or you can enjoy the detailed understanding about how forging is done. Really makes it a perfect tourism attraction for all ages and all interests.
Here we are, Conner Prairie. You'll see.
For Conner Prairie, Prairietown is the core experience. It's what's been here for 50 years now. And I think because it was one of America's earliest living history first-person sites, I think it's always been innovative, not because of just the interpretation, but also the type of programming that resulted from that. So Prairietown continues to evolve. And I think that's what Eli Lilly, our founder, really wanted out of Prairietown.
So Conner Prairie really begins in 1934 with Eli Lilly's purchase of the Conner House. So Conner House was in very bad shape at that time, and he purchased it and preserved it and saved it. And he also had an understanding of the educational potential of this place.
He was very enamored of Williamsburg and wanted to create something that resembled Williamsburg here. And he was a huge collector, so he started to collect buildings and move them in.
So the buildings that comprise Lenape Camp today were actually moved on site by Eli Lilly and his team to represent Conner's trading post and barns he would have had.
The collection of buildings which he had started, the log cabins and the old dairy barn and the Chinese house, which were on the east side of the river. The west side of the river was really the area where the Conner farm was being operated.
He had always been interested in agriculture. He started Conner Prairie Farms as a show farm. So these are animals that go to competitions and win awards. With the World War II era, he started to feel that that was a bit indulgent and pivoted his focus to breeding animals that could be used as livestock, and with a focus on productivity of those animals. Fast forward to 1964, and this is when Eli Lilly decides to give Conner Prairie to Earlham College.
At that point, Conner Prairie started changing real rapidly.
So beginning in 1964, our visitation was around 2,500 people, and then that visitation essentially doubled every year after that.
And you have to remember, there was no Prairietown, there was no Civil War journey. The barn was the museum center for many, many years. In the 60s, Conner Prairie was working on their expansion. And that was so cool. When buildings were being brought down Allisonville, it was pretty exciting.
There are only two buildings that are actually inherent to Conner Prairie, and neither one of those buildings are in Prairietown. So every single one of the structures that you see out there were moved at some time to Conner Prairie.
Yeah, John Shippers, my former boss and my boss at the time then, they had actually set up a work crew and everything, and they put up the buildings.
The powers to be out front didn't have a lot of knowledge of buildings or what's going to be. So they left it pretty much up to me and the two researchers we had to identify if this building should be here or not.
March 31st, 1974 is when Prairietown opens. At that time, it included the blacksmith's house, the Curtis House, where we are right now, the blacksmith shop, the Potter's Complex, which is now the Reclamation Cabin as part of our Promised Land as Proving Ground exhibit, and another cabin that is also no longer here.
Prairietown was a little smaller. They were just bringing in the Golden Eagle Inn, It had come from Westfield, and a lot of our visitors remember watching it come on a flatbed.
People who had lived there had left stuff. I mean, they found boxes in walls, things like that. And it was absolutely fascinating to go through.
The inn, they always thought that the back room was an add-on to the house. It wasn't. When we tore them apart, we realized how they were originally made. So we found evidence like that all through the place. The general store down there was just a frame. And that was the first building I think I worked on. And we built all the cabinets in the store and built a lot of artifacts to go in the store too.
Myron Vorax came along at the point that Mr. Lilly started giving the property and money and stock to Earlham College.
And Myron Vorax brought in the lead folklorist really in the United States at the time, named Henry Glassy. And it was Myron and Henry that developed the concept of Prairietown. They wanted it to be as authentic as possible, given that a lot of interpretation in museums coming up to the 1976 bicentennial was wrong. You know, it just didn't show the past as it really was, and it was a lot of romanticism. In creating Prairietown, he wanted to show that people came in at different economic strata, different temperaments, different religions. And they also were the ones that came up with what was called the Conner Prairie concept. It was the first in the United States to do that, where the interpreters spoke in first person.
All of the Prairietown characters are fictional because there really wasn't anyone that they could find who had the depth of research and primary sources necessary to build a really full and complete character biography.
If we want to have a conversation about slavery, or we want to have a conversation about temperance, we can look at the historical views people had and kind of to pick which view we want that character to espouse.
The characters that we made up were based on demographic research. Where were people coming from to settle in Indiana? Dr. Campbell was a composite of 3 different doctors that lived and practiced in central Indiana.
There are some who really think that the best way to share history is through the real life people, even if there's not a whole lot of information from those people. If I have a person but I don't have any of its views on banking, well, if I got kids asking me about money, it just feels wrong, morally wrong to put words in someone's mouth. In 200 years, if someone says they're Dylan Rawls, I don't want them to, say I don't like chicken or something when I do love chicken. So I mean.
But we are definitely ascribing emotions to fake people, which is also an interesting aspect, that these character bios are not just, here's your job, here's your heritage.
And again, it allows you to grow and change too. It's not a real person that we're removing from our story today, so you don't have to worry about the legacy that you are kind of messing with when you're dealing with historical characters who really lived.
From the earliest days of Prairietown, the stories that we wanted to tell in this space were paramount, to the extent that nearly every building we brought on site was retrofitted in some way to fit the stories that we wanted to tell. So even a building like the Campbell House, which was actually a doctor's house, was significantly retrofitted to fit into Dr. Campbell's story, as opposed to Dr. Ruddle's story, who was the doctor who had actually lived in the house.
So we are taking objects out of context and creating a new context for them.
But we tried to make it look like a village, and we were down the National Road, and we studied an awful lot of buildings and how their placement was.
Some of the cabins, when a donation was accepted, they would take a cabin that was more or less whole, but to make up for rotted logs or whatever, they would take logs from another cabin and replace it. And just through time, I've probably, in my tenure here, probably replaced 50 logs in the cabins across the grounds. We spend a good bit of time just fixing up 60+ historic buildings.
A lot of places that you might visit that have historic buildings don't always repair their buildings in the same way that we do. We really make an effort to repair these buildings as they would have been repaired at the time.
When you look at a building, you've got to determine how much original fabric is actually in that building. When they were moved here, there was so much that was changed, so much that was modified. There are a few buildings like the Golden Eagle Inn, the Doctor's House, certainly the William Conner House, that are significant buildings. And when we approach those buildings, we do just what's needed to get those buildings fixed up without causing damage to the material that's there.
The herb shed, which is now at what is now the Turners, it's changed so many times what it was, the Gregory's and stuff. That was the original carpentry shop. And that wasn't much room, especially when you had that lathe in there. So the decision was to make a more workable shop, one that had plenty of room for the carpenter to work in and also to accommodate our visitors.
We started literally with a pile of logs, spent a few months hand hewing the timbers, and then we joined them together using traditional hand tools. So it truly is a hand-built building as it would be in the 1830s.
At Conner Prairie, we are kind of special in that we actually have original objects that we use in our interpretation on the grounds. We did formal furnishing plans, so lots of research involved in that to decide what objects should be in which buildings. And we frequently move objects around from post to post to improve programming. Eli Lilly, of course, started our collection, and he spent many years cultivating original objects. There's about 3,500 objects that Eli Lilly actually brought to Conner Prairie.
Well, collections in the beginning was in an old barn, and if it rained, water would get in. If it snowed, snow would come in. It wasn't climate controlled at all, and mice found it very attractive. There were different things like brass and woodwork and things that couldn't be cleaned in a 2-hour span that we would go out on the afternoon and be in costume and clean on the grounds. Rebecca was showing me some of the things that they do, and it's just from what we went from, we have just stepped leaps, and they still are doing it.
We're always thinking about the future and how our collections will be viewed 50 years from now, 100 years from now.
The artifacts share just as much as the interpreters on what we were like and who we were.
We have the opportunity to engage with this great wealth of material culture, you can see it here around me, and invite our guests along to experience those items in the same way, right?
I think an object in a traditional museum is removed from its world, its daily use.
I can look at a candlestick and I can imagine what it looks like with a candle in it, but I can't quite imagine how little light that puts out when it's dark.
And then you start looking around, you're like, oh wow, a lot of these cabins on the inside are whitewashed. Or maybe the candle's by a mirror. Why is that? Because that's reflecting light better and it's helping them amplify the candlelight.
It doesn't matter what the tool is. I think seeing it used gives you a better understanding of why, and it makes sense.
If you don't have those objects in your toolbox and have them accessible, which means reproductions that you can actively use, you can't really build the basis for bringing people into the past or showing them how life was.
It would have been unusual for a town like this to have a potter and a carpenter and a blacksmith all in one place. But the planners of Prairietown understood that people want to see those things happening. They need something to watch.
So our basic trades are weaving and textiles, carpentry, blacksmithing, and pottery.
Clay's melted, we'll take rock salt, common salt.
I can think of things that we've done in the blacksmith shop. Built a 2-wheel cart. We actually built the wheels. We put the tires on, reheat them up and shrink them on. People like to see how things are done.
At least pottery and carpentry work is still things that people are very familiar with, even yet today. But they don't understand historically how pottery was made.
Just watching a good potter, you're going to learn. I know I learned so much to see it actually happening in front of you. The kiln firing is the big thing. We single fired raw clay in there, And so it took about 18 hours or so of firing to do it, because you really had to baby the clay in the beginning, because you can pop a cold pot with a hot flame right from the get-go.
Trades were always, I think, the #1 place where people gravitated. They liked to hear the interpreters talk, but they wanted to see what they were doing with their hands. So if you were cooking, you were making something out of clay. If you were the blacksmith, they wanted to know history, but they wanted to see what you're doing. The children, I feel like, really benefited from going to school. And we had the Loud School. They really could see themselves in that schoolroom because it's something they did.
Put up with any tomfoolery. We've got a lot of learning to do here and not much time to do it.
And I would run them through the lessons. It was a song, or it was, doing your vowels and your syllables.
But I think we could start learning a little bit of everything, so we'll all be learning together.
That building would rock and roll. I mean, people would be laughing, they'd be trying, I'd yell out, "I can't hear you."
We're getting here so late this morning. It's time we were getting home, so we'll just have to do our lessons tomorrow.
I think one of the things I've always liked about Prairietown, the little minutia of everyday life, is something that you could interpret.
99.999% of humans throughout history are the everyday humans living everyday life. And so it's much more relevant to us.
The interpreters here can actually say, you know what, I'm just like you. I have chores just like you have. I have ways of communicating, dancing, singing, or cooking. Our lives aren't as different than you think they are.
It creates opportunities, and it creates a way of getting people to understand a life that is both everyday and incredibly common, but also missing from the historical record.
A lot of people are displaced in history. History is not a welcoming place for a lot of the population. But even as a woman, if you put me back in 1836, I didn't get captured in this historical record. What my daily life was like was not going to be written down. I almost certainly would not have been literate and wouldn't have been captured. So by looking at those more common experiences, we can pull out those stories that otherwise disappear and that otherwise we don't see show up in your 8th grade or 4th grade textbook.
And that was one thing I think I miss with one of the characters that we don't have in town anymore. Mrs. McClure was illiterate, but we tried to get across the point that even though she couldn't read and write, did not in any way mean that she was not intelligent. If you're saying, okay, today we've got 2 of us at home that we're cooking for, and tomorrow I'm cooking for 30, you've got to know how to scale up that recipe.
1836, you're cooking with fire, not gas on a stovetop, with a wood fire.
We had cooking in lots of places, seasonal foods. They all had different menus.
Everybody eats and can walk into a kitchen and, recognize a food or recognize that smell or say, this smells just like my grandma's house.
And then we have a conversation about what is being fixed, and maybe it relates to something that they have had.
Food serves as a connecting point. Food is central to community. When we have a wedding, there's always food. If there's a funeral, there's food. When we celebrate Christmas or 4th of July, there's food. This community, this communion over food. If there's a way for people to understand that, maybe we can be encouraging our guests, sit down at the table and enjoy and talk. And let food serve as the centerpiece of those conversations.
And people have become, if anything, far more removed from how does food get to the table. It just kind of appears, you just go to the grocery.
There's kind of a disconnect between most people. We used to be, huge farming community, right? That was our roots, and now that's so far from a lot of people's day-to-day existence.
1836, you were totally tuned into the season of the food. That certain foods were available only certain times of the year.
That you have to process that once you have grown it. And if you want to preserve it, because what are you going to eat in the winter?
I think especially if you do the work yourself, Or if you realize that that pig has, given its life for us to eat, that we should be respectful of the resources that we've got and not waste things.
It's really important for kids to see those connections to, okay, I bought this thing in the store, but it didn't just randomly appear in the store. It came from this animal.
The animals are an immediate engagement point with guests, and they're crucial for the story of Prairietown. Everybody was farming. So I feel like you can't have Prairietown unless you have agriculture. People come in and are astounded by how tall our oxen are, or how cute and little the baby goats are. So just giving them a way to contextualize all of that.
This is a space where they can learn and be safe and interact and touch and experience that in a way they can't anywhere else.
When you walk through town and you see the pigs or you see the cows and you see the sheep, like, it really starts getting people thinking about how people in that time frame would have been using those animals.
One of our things we like to do when it's, in the afternoon it's hot, and we'll take a chicken or some sheep down to the store and pretend like we're selling them, and try to get some guests involved. How much would you think this sheep is worth?
Without those animals, a lot of times people wouldn't think about having those conversations, and so it's a good segue into historically what those animals were used for, and then look at what they were doing and see how we're still doing that today, just in different ways.
A lot of living history sites have animals on site. They may not be, actively conserving, heritage breeds, or they may just be there just to have, just for a show. My predecessor, Kevin Miller, wanted to take it a step further. He wanted to have the animals, to educate about them, but then also have them have a purpose beyond just being here.
At Conner Prairie, we are focused on 5 heritage breeds. We've got our English Longhorn cattle, our goats, American rabbits, tuna sheep, and Ossabaw hogs.
The heritage breeds are, I like to call generalists. Our cattle in the 1830s had to be good for draft, for pulling things, oxen. They had to be good for milk. The females had to give good milk, be good mothers. They had to have enough flesh on them to provide meat when their life was finished. Our modern dairies, their cattle just focus on one thing, giving you 10 gallons of milk every day. And that doesn't fit with the heritage breeds or the multi-purpose breeds.
As a museum, we are actively working towards keeping them from the brink of extinction. We're very active with all of the breed associations that we're in. We have some of the largest herds of the livestock that we have, and we are actively working on getting those animals to other people to continue those genetics. We want to be able to have these animals for the future generations, because if they die out now, we're never going to know what they could have done for us. We're never going to know what they looked like.
Animals were a major part of everyday life and have been throughout history. Animals were critical for survival, and so it just adds that extra layer of authenticity to the Prairietown experience. People in 19th century Indiana depended on animals for their food, for their fiber.
And it's not just you grab the fiber and you make something. It's an entire process. Think, what is it that I want to make? What fiber am I going to use? Do I want to use wool? Do I want to, use linen? And then the design, and then the actual making that fiber, and the physical work and the time that it takes. I can fill the spindle with about 1 ounce of wool in 1/2 hour. If a pair of socks are 4 ounces, how long do I have to spin? That's just the spinning. We haven't sheared the sheep, we haven't washed the wool, then you have to card it, then you're spinning. And then maybe you want to dye it, so now here's another step. If you're a knitter, you need to wind that yarn into a ball. You're not going to knit from a skein. So you got to get somebody to help you. Hold the skein, and then you wind the ball by hand, and finally you are ready to knit that 1 pair of 4-ounce socks.
When I first started, our costuming was not anywhere near what it is today. Oh, yeah, we looked like little cookie cutter people.
We've always tried to be authentic, to get patterns that are based on original garments. I know when they were first starting, that was not easy.
I think it was sometime in the late 80s. We really began to do a whole lot more with our costuming. And oh my goodness, it made such a difference.
Someone found a man who owned an original 1836 dress and some men's costumes, and they got permission from him to take a pattern from those items. It was Bill Covey, and so we called it the Covey work dress.
The diversity of clothing style was much, much greater. I was really glad to get into something that looked a lot more appropriate.
If you study how clothes go together or how clothes are made in the past, you'll notice that when they go on the body, they hold you in a different way, right? So we're not used to that. We're not used to our clothes holding us in a certain way in this time period, right?
In the morning when you come out and you start putting on those clothes, and you don't become that person, but you learn that you're going to have to stand the way they would have stood for the dress to fit right, and you've got all the proper undergarments. Being in costume really helps me a lot to interpret.
I mean, I think after a while you get so used to it, it's just a second skin. But I think for me, especially coming from a theater background, like that is me putting on the character in the morning. But also as a interpreter of color, I'm putting on 400 years of history, and that gives me a different respect for the clothing that I choose. I'm particular about colors that I choose. I'm particular about which dress I wear on which days.
And when you have, 3 yards of fabric wrapped around your waist, that's the tail of your coat, right? And you swish in a certain way, right? You have to be aware of your spacing in a different way. It makes you appreciate like dancing, for example, Mrs. Campbell, if I'm dancing with Mrs. Campbell, her arms can't go above her head because she's got a stays on and sleeve puffs on that don't allow her to do that. So you have to be kind of more mindful of the way that you carry yourself.
I feel different, and I feel things differently in costume. I am wearing cotton, I am wearing linen near the fire. My legs never get hot. My legs always get hot in blue jeans. Again, it's one of those conversations you can have 200 years later or earlier, whichever way you look at it. If someone were to step in on that conversation, they would think it was all in the present day.
It allows comparing and contrasting fashion styles and fashion sense. Guests can see what the textures of the clothing look like and how they might relate to what a guest is wearing when they come and visit.
You really did wear your wealth on your sleeve, right? So people would put good money into the fabrics that they chose, into the tailoring that they were able to afford. Or conversely, they would make do and mend and make things last and stretch them as long as they possibly could.
Dr. George Washington Campbell is probably more of a high-class character, so I'm going to wear a little fancier clothing, maybe more silk, compared to when I'm the schoolmaster or when I'm portraying James Whitaker, the store owner here in town.
That aspect of engaging with clothing is very much an everyday connection point for people of the past and people of today. In the past, it's amazing. It's a unique, exciting opportunity in the 1830s, let's say, to see a pianoforte and to let alone hear somebody play it, right? Most people have never encountered professional musicians in their lives, right?
At the doctor's house, I did play on the piano there. I taught myself a few period things that I could play, Scottish and Irish tunes that Dr. Campbell would have known.
We have a lot of music. It's just a lot of singing music, right? It's a lot of fiddle songs, it's a lot of dulcimers and things like that.
I specifically taught myself to play fiddle, holding it down here rather than under the chin, as a lower class sort of a fellow would have done. And I worked very hard documenting tunes that fit this time period, and that's hard to do because there are a lot of fiddle tunes we just don't know the provenance.
I think music is universal. It crosses all cultures. I can relate to a music. I can hear a beat, I can hear a sound, I can hear a song. And even if I don't know the words to that song, I might be getting a feeling that it's like, I like the way I feel when I hear that rhythm.
Art and music is a human thing, right? And so when we have these opportunities to engage in that practice and that performance, I think it's really special.
I think the Museum Center was a turning point for Conner Prairie.
Earlham finally agreed, after lots of pressure,
to get out of the old dairy barn and to have a museum center where we could actually conduct some programming and have some offices and whatever.
It was slow for us to get things done because we had to figure out how to get the money to do it. If you don't expand something, you die. And I think Polly Johns pretty well knew that. And she was always trying to do something new. Polly raised all that money for the visitor center.
It allowed us all sorts of other opportunities to engage the public in different ways. And I do think it made us a little less like a small, sleepy history museum that was doing really innovative things for the time, and really grew us up into being one of the big players. That allowed us to bring in Smithsonian exhibits, allowed us to do exhibits of our collections. There was sort of a dividing line. If things occurred outside the museum center, then they had to have much more historical accuracy, and if they occurred inside the museum center, there was a little bit more latitude. I would say as a staff member, we felt somewhat constrained during the Earlham years. The ability to really fly occurred, I think, for the staff after the Earlham years.
Over time, Earlham continued to evolve and allow a community-based museum board to operate Conner Prairie, starting in the 80s and continuing on.
As the board became more active and engaged and involved, Earlham got more and more nervous. My last act as chairman of the board at Conner Prairie was to form a governance committee and appoint myself chairman of the governance committee in perpetuity, which turned out to be short-lived. And we were pointing out what we believed to be violations of the trust responsibilities that Earlham owed to Conner Prairie. And we had a meeting scheduled. The president of Earlham College, after our lunch was finished, said, "Here is our final offer." And so we left the room, we read through it, it was horrible. It went backwards from where we'd been. So he came back in the room and said, "We could not recommend this to our full board." At which point, doors opened, and Doug Bennett said, "Well, this may seem awkward, but thank you for your service. You were all dismissed as members of the board. John Herbst, you're fired." So we left the room, went to my office in Fishers, and formed Save the Prairie, Inc., and began the process of taking Earlham out of the picture.
Well, ironically, my first day working with the youth was the day that they fired the board.
And it was a weird day because we're here and we're like, why are there helicopters? There are not helicopters over Conner Prairie, and why is the news here? You know, that's snapping back to modern times. We come in and they're like, oh, by the way, the president of Earlham fired the board and we're kind of not sure what's next.
And there was definitely a feeling of anger, being upset. What's the future going to hold? Our interpreters' expensive ornaments, which was a quote that came out. What is the value of our work and how do we justify this?
I, as vice president, was really getting a sense of what needed to happen here. When the board and the president was fired, this is terrible to say, but I felt like I had an opportunity to move Conner Prairie forward. As a staff, I created staff committees to reconsider the mission statement. So they were from all levels. And then we came together in one big assembly, and essentially the staff rewrote the mission statement. That would never happen if there was a board in place.
We came together as interpreters to think about what is the value of what we do. There was a closeness that was felt because we felt this beautiful thing that we've created together, that the guest value could be in jeopardy, it could be taken away.
Finally, one of the deputy attorney generals met with one of the Earlham board members in Washington, D.C., and he showed him the draft of a complaint that they were prepared to file. And he said, if we don't get something done, we're going to file this complaint. And that got their attention. And then a serious settlement conversation began and resulted in a settlement. It took Earlham out of the picture pretty much entirely.
After the governance dispute, there was a tremendous opportunity to change Conner Prairie, sort of from top to bottom.
Knowing that we were under our own power to succeed or fail.
We'd gone through a year-long strategic planning exercise, and basically outlined a lot of the things that are here today, which was basically moving from just Prairietown, the heart and soul of Conner Prairie, to other ways to portray history.
And after Earlham disappeared, we had the power to do all that. So we could do a master plan, we could have a capital campaign to build Civil War and have it be successful. We could raise the money for the balloon. We could make our own decisions. But each one of those audiences was a separate project unto itself.
When I first came, there were, say, 3 or 4 people in a building. There'd be somebody at the front door that would greet people, orient them, tell them what was going on. They would hold them there until they saw that the person in the next room had an empty room. We just had this little factory, this little conveyance of people going through. So it was quite regimented. You stayed on script. You had a goal. My goal as Mrs. Barkley was to talk about traveling and the difficulties of traveling in 1836.
It may or may not work. Some groups will be super interested and others don't care, and you can kind of tell because they're starting to wiggle and look around, especially if they're 4th graders.
How can we make the learning experience more fun, memorable, and meaningful for everyone? And can our guests help us discover how we do that? We call our initiative Opening Doors.
Opening Doors was a steep climb. There was so much interpreter pushback. They did not want to change the way they did things.
In other museum settings, it was all contextual with the social setting. So who you went to the museum with really determined what kind of educational experience you were having. But here, there was always this third element. There was always another person in the room. So they'd put microphones on the kids of the family and let them know, we're gonna record your whole experience. You know, don't be self-conscious about it. We're not judging you in any way. We just want to see how learning is happening in this environment.
We could see that there was a lot of talking from an interpreter and then a little comment from a guest. A lot of talking from an interpreter, a little comment from a guest. But we also recorded those conversations as they were walking up and down the path. The kids would ask a question when they got out of a building. You know, the adult was like, oh, I don't know, or they'd come up with something that may or may not be correct. As interpreters, as educators, we want them to have the correct information about the past and not just something that, well, maybe it's this.
And so there was so much more burden, especially on the parents, to make sense of this experience. And that's when we started realizing we needed to change that approach. We needed to think about how we could tailor the experiences for each group that came through. The implementation was going to be tricky, right? Because an organization that loves history as much as this one does can be, I think, especially difficult to change at times. We don't even change the year. How are we going to change kind of our core operating principle?
Before Opening Doors, everybody at noon would sit down on their respective posts and eat. The problem for especially the 4th graders coming through at the time is if they happened to hit Prairietown at noon, you'd ask them, what did you learn about the past? I learned that people in the past ate. Maybe as you're eating, you do something you would never do in real life, which is turn around and start talking and, you know, let your food get cold. And so little concessions like that, where instead of our purpose is to live life exactly as people would in the past, became the point is to make this accessible to somebody coming in.
The focus was on engagement. You didn't do things that excluded visitors, even if it was historically appropriate. We broadened the history that we included. They used to say then that interpreters were taught to fish for interest.
You cast lines out and you see what bait catches people's interest and what they want to talk to you about. And then you know enough about your history, your character, that you know how they would respond to these questions.
Or respectfully, that they really don't want to have a conversation, they just want to watch. And I think that's an important thing too, because you can push people to the point that they walk out.
Free choice learning.
Well, Roy, free choice learning simply refers to the learning that people engage in throughout their lives, when they get to decide when, where, how, and with whom to learn.
Neuroscience tells us that when you get to
go on a journey of learning about something that you're interested in, that your brain is going to make a lot more connections to prior knowledge and also encourage you to learn more because it's a subject that you're interested in. Choice is one of the most important components of learning environments and experiences that lead to memory making and the knowledge that you can retain over time.
The challenge for some museums is you're this nexus point between free choice learning and more formal education. There are field trips coming here. They have to fulfill certain criteria to have a field trip here. And I think Conner Prairie has always done a great job of understanding both sides of that, of how you can make a free choice learning environment successful, even in a formal education context, because we have such great material to work with. We have such great props, really, to provide that you just can't get in a classroom.
When I first started here, it just seemed so bizarre to me to have people out in costume talking about these stories. When I first joined Conner Prairie, I did not know very much about the 1830s. And then when I got here, I realized how much, honestly, heart goes behind a lot of what interpretation is, and just the way that you can have this freedom to explore your real life interests, but through a lens of what it means to Prairietown.
I think Prairietown has always been the thing that's pushed us to do things outside of Prairietown.
There was a lot of cooking going on, and visitors would say, you know, I want to experience this closer and such. So we started with the more production-oriented kind of Hearthside suppers.
The whole narrative of Hearthside Suppers was William Conner hired people from Prairietown to entertain guests.
It's an amazing program because you get guests not for 5 minutes or for 20 minutes. You get them for about 3 hours.
So you've been in this house with that fire going and the food cooking and the candles going and either the cold air coming across the prairie or the sun setting. You can think you picture it, but you don't till you actually do.
William Conner's presence on this land really influenced the stories that we tell. It's because of him that we tell the story of the Lenape people as opposed to some folks who have their ancestral homelands in this area.
One thing that Conner Prairie allowed me to do was to show the real way that tribal people lived and how we interacted with other tribes, how the fur trade was important, some of the drawbacks to the fur trade. Conner Prairie always allowed me to pretty much show whatever I wanted to show here. In that sense, I tried to be true to my tribal ways and pass on the language, the culture, the history, the art, and I've been able to do that now actually 20 years as an interpreter here at Conner Prairie.
Our growth is not separate or isolated from the investments and the ways in which we think about using Prairietown as a teaching tool. And instead, it's the foundation and the bedrock on which we're able to grow.
I think Prairietown's biggest child was Liberty Corner.
You come across the big red bridge, right, and you'd be transported 50 years into the future. So you might come to Prairietown on a given day and meet Susanna Zimmerman. 50 years in the future, you might meet that same person, aged 50 years, right? And you meet her as an older woman and she's living with her family here.
But we could tell a lot of stories about that time period and how things had changed, how, you know, people were dealing post-Civil War with death and grief and life moving on and railroads and all the things that had happened in that time period.
One of the major unfoldings today at Conner Prairie is Promised Land is Proving Ground. And this is beyond Prairietown's 50th anniversary, beyond just the confines of this village, as it's affected every part of our institution.
Promised Land is Proving Ground is our way to really address a more inclusive story of African people at Conner Prairie. We've had programs in the past that really just dealt with a small part of it, and they were done for a limited amount of days throughout the year. So we knew that we needed to be fully inclusive and tell that story each and every day.
Promised Land is Proving Ground is a story of Black perseverance, not just in Indiana, but in America as a whole. It focuses on the 4 F's. So we talk about food, faith, family, and fellowship. Those are the things that make people people. And these things were, of course, different for African Americans settling anywhere, especially settling in a place like Indiana. Indiana was on paper a free state. The Northwest Territory was free, but it was not free in the way that you would expect. A place where we could test the American ideals. Liberty and justice for all, what does that mean?
It is going to be a place where these big, not so easy conversations can happen. A really key element of a lot of sites of conscience work is bringing past to present. In other words, history is not just what happened 200 years ago or 100 years ago. History continues to happen, and to understand that all of our actions today and in the future are influenced by that history, and we can learn from that.
It bookends Prairietown, it's integrated into Prairietown. We didn't want it to be a segregated experience. We want this to be visible, and we want to tell this history right. What we're putting in the building, the stories we're willing to tell, and the fact that we have rotating exhibit space here so we can keep telling stories is very, very, very important.
It is a celebratory exhibit about the contributions and cultural retentions of African Americans in America, and it is all about being able to tell the full story of Black and brown people who have come to this country and have made their mark.
It fits because we've always been an Indiana history museum, and this is part of Indiana history, this is part of American history. For people who've been coming to Prairietown for years and like the way it is and have gotten used to the way it is, this is a very big change. And we're excited to see a generation of people and a generation of kids who grew up who don't know a Prairietown without Promised Land as proving ground in it.
It's fascinating to think about the evolution of our guests over time at Conner Prairie. To understand who may have been here 50 years ago when Eli and Ruth Lilly were offering private tours, when this was a space that only a few were granted access to before it became truly Conner Prairie. Those guests of that era were closer to the history that we're teaching inside of 1836 Prairietown than perhaps the young families that we're seeing come through the doors today.
I would get, when I was a teen and in my 20s, here in the Loom House, people would say, yeah, my grandpa or I, we used to use onion skins to dye our Easter eggs. I don't hear that anymore. I'll say, your grandpa or your great-grandpa and grandma used onion skins to dye their Easter eggs. And I think in the back of my mind, geez, they're all dead. Maybe part of my job is, this is what your, ancestors did. And they told me so. I was a kid and they told me that. So you're getting it firsthand. Wow.
It's things that people are disconnected from. And I think that here they have a chance to be reconnected.
We tend to think of Prairietown as Groundhog's Day. It's the same on cycle every year, but it actually changes. And part of the reason it changes is because the people who play these characters change. And so the way that one person plays Dr. Campbell, that's going to be in some ways imitated as they teach future interpreters.
I learned Dr. Campbell from Eddie Grogan. I learned mostly by watching him, seeing how he delivered content, seeing how he made Dr. Campbell in 1836 medicine relatable to guests.
I was always a little bit paranoid that some smart MD was going to come in and catch me up on things. And so I just made quite a study of early 19th century medicine. I got to a point where we would have actual doctors come in, and they assumed that I was a doctor or at least a medical student. And it's because I could talk the talk.
Because I learned it from him, I feel like that's a legacy that I'm getting from him. And as I have staff persons and youth volunteers who work alongside me here in Campbell House, I hope that I can pass on that Prairietown, Dr. Campbell, Eddie Grogan legacy onto the next generation.
It's one thing to read about, how to cook a meal over an open fire It's another thing to work alongside somebody who's done it 1,000 times and can show you really the nuances of how to do it. Having those legacy interpreters here, they are carrying on traditions and passing them on in the same way that folks would have living in 1836.
When I find a new person, a young person who has come in, and in conversation they find out I do something particular, oh, I've always wanted to do that, will you teach me? Absolutely. And so people that are 40 years younger than I am, maybe even a little more so, are excited about learning it, and then they'll be able to do that, and hopefully it'll be able to be passed along.
Working with some of the people at Conner Prairie has been truly a rewarding experience. There are a lot of people here who just have such a passion for history, such a depth of knowledge. Even being a child, working around somebody who would just educate me the whole day and not get annoyed with all of my annoying questions was a really validating experience.
I personally think that having curious children who enjoy learning and value learning around so many different topics, history, science, math, the arts, is crucial for the future of the country.
I think that the legacy is just so many kids being able to have, and adults to have, that direct connection to the past and a believable past that they can step into.
Conner Prairie's philosophy out here really allows for children to have an ownership of their learning and to kind of drive their curiosity and their imagination. It allows them to really have some time and some space and freedom to be curious and to be imaginative. We believe that choice is a really important way to serve our guests, and that is true for Prairietown and also beyond. If you spend time at Treetop Outpost, children are free to roam, guests of all ages can play and explore. We have invitations out in many areas of our grounds where you can choose to interact with certain people and certain objects, and that might turn into an art project or a collaboration between you and the people that you're traveling with.
One of the things that we try to emphasize with our youth volunteers, it's not just putting on a costume and acting like a person from the past. It's not just taking care of animals and learning all those skills. It's also the ability to relate to people. It's having a conversation with somebody that's a complete stranger. It's being able to make history relatable for children.
I think when guests came in, young guests, and they saw another kid doing something that they thought was cool, they immediately want to talk to you about it.
And so having youth in Prairietown on the grounds, playing games, just doing a variety of things, it allows the younger guests to connect and to engage better with people closer to their age.
I think too that sometimes adults are really intimidating to children. If you have a youth volunteer who's in the space also interpreting, it's much more likely that a child's going to feel comfortable to approach them because they probably don't have it all figured out. It feels a lot safer, there's less risk there for the guest.
You can see the change in these kids. You see them go from shy and quiet and real timid, but after they get confidence, then you start to see them really blossom. It's wonderful to see.
I love it when guests come and they ask a million questions. They're always like, oh, I'm sorry that I'm asking so many questions. I tell them, no, I love it.
When Prairietown was introduced, you have to remember that there were not that many museums in the country doing this kind of programming. And so I think its legacy will be early on. It was very cutting edge and somewhat controversial because it would deal with those issues that are difficult to talk about. And I think that we need to look back and be thankful that the vision was there to take it beyond churning butter and to take it into all the depths of humanity that existed in the 1800s, just like they do now.
Where I live, there's a lot of growth and expansion, but to know that there's 1,000 acres preserved for nature, for history, for input, for dialogue, for conversations about culture, race, diversity, as well as how did Mrs. Conner live? How did Dr. Campbell treat a child with a splinter? So just little things like that build to me a very effective and important part of Indiana history.
we're able to take Conner Prairie, which is already extremely well known as an innovator in the museum field, and now take it to a whole new level. As an accredited museum, as a Smithsonian affiliate, I think you're going to see Conner Prairie continue to evolve.
It's now our job to be the stewards of this history, right? And to make sure that those stories don't get lost, but that it's understood what these tools were used for, how precious they were at a time when resources were limited, and why the need for caring for them and carrying them forward in today is such a critical part of stewardship.
I hope that we're a place where skills are kept, where if the world moves on from hand sewing and quilting and maybe woodworking and blacksmithing, this is a place where those skills can continue to be taught and kept.
People ask me like, why haven't you left? You have a full-time job, you're doing wonderful things with that job. Yeah, I know, but like there's still power in what I feel like I'm doing out here. The experiences that I've gotten out here and the experiences I can give the guest. Being able to teach the cooking class last year on African American cuisine was just like so wonderful for me, and to get to do it in Prairietown was hands over knees like the best thing that I did last year. And I hope that I can still do things like that 50 years from now.
You hear people say, oh, if those walls could talk. But they can't. But people can.
Interpreters are the ones who carry out the mission. If a museum is about a mission, they're the ones that do it. They are the ones that engage people. I always marveled at their skills at doing it. Without the interpreters, there was no mission at Conner Prairie.
This was a place that we created together. It has been the culmination of 50 years of interpreters and volunteers and guests. Again, without the guests, the essential component of the community that is Prairietown, we don't exist, we don't evolve. It doesn't come to life. And so I would think that the legacy, especially from the community and our members, is that they were a vital part of this experience.
Prairietown, I think, will always be known for good, strong presentation of the past, of history, of Indiana's history. But not just Indiana. When you think about it, it really is human history.
If you don't know your history, you don't really understand who you are in the present or where you're going to be in the future. So history is important. It's important to understand what life was like. Things move so fast nowadays, and things change so quickly.
I think there have been times in my time here that it's been a place away from modern times. And not just the nostalgia, but sometimes we need a place to step away. And Prairietown's been that.
You know, the legacy of Prairietown is bigger than any one person. Prairietown is bigger than Eli Lilly. Conner Prairie is bigger than William Conner. It is a legacy that is made up of the marks of all these people, planting that seed of curiosity, connecting people to memories, teaching people new things, challenging them on these hard and fast assumptions that we have. Yeah. The legacy is found in the people.
Gotta stop playing this. Gotta stop playing this game. Gotta stop playing this. Gotta stop playing this. Gotta stop. stop playing this. Gotta stop.